Okay, so our last lecture in class talked about European imperialism in Africa, which of course was, it was just there and it was waiting to be gobbled up. And by 1914, the vast majority of it had been gobbled up by various European powers, except for Ethiopia, which successfully defended itself from the Italians, and Liberia, which was also nominally independent, although you could also consider it an American colony on a certain level. In any event, it wasn't just in Africa that Europeans got involved. There was, the British took India. All right, that's a whole story. Today we'll talk about China and Japan, which provide an interesting contrast to Africa. They don't, both of those places had functioning states. So the Europeans never gobbled them up, but they did do things to exploit them. And so that becomes a priority for the Chinese and the Japanese. How are we going to deal with these Europeans? Now here is actually, we've seen this before. All the way back in the 15th century, the Portuguese sailed down the coast of Africa to get to India and then to Southeast Asia. Largely they were looking for spices. The Spanish decided to go across the ocean and ended up discovering the New World. And then, of course, other European powers got in on the act. And we saw that. That was one of the reasons why European colonialism happens, is because European powers are competing with each other. And so if I don't grab that colony, some other power will. What about China? China is where it is now. From 1644, it was ruled by the Manchus, also known as the Qing dynasty. And, through most of history, China is vastly more sophisticated than Europe is. And unfortunately, it kind of went to their head. Okay? And they never believed that they were a country like any other country. They believed that they were the middle kingdom, the center of the world, sort of halfway between earth and heaven, and that the emperor, in fact, was the son of heaven. And so there's no possibility of diplomacy under these conditions. You can't have an agreement between equals, because there are no equals to the emperor. All you can do is come and bow before him and offer him tribute, and he might reciprocate. Okay, and so that is, and of course, as I say, they felt that they were sophisticated and superior, and they had no interest in trade with the rest of the world. They felt the rest of the world had very little to offer them. Now there is a small entrepot at what's called Canton, nowadays called Guangzhou, that's just up the river from Hong Kong, and that's the only place where foreigners were allowed to trade. There are things that you can get in China, like tea, that Europeans like, but it wasn't free trade by any means. The Chinese really made you pay for it. Your margins were very, very small if you were trading at Guangzhou. So the British East India Company came up with a novel idea, and that is that they would start growing opium in India. They'd grow opium poppies and they'd process it, and they would bring that to Guangzhou, and they would trade, and they basically get the Chinese hooked on opium. So then the Chinese would be interested in trading with them. So the Chinese called this foreign mud. And once you're hooked on opium, you'll happily trade. All right, so this is not really a high point in British imperial history. This is something that is really kind of embarrassing, actually. And so the emperor said, no, you can't do that. So they banned the trade of opium, and at one point they seized a bunch of opium and burned it. And the thing about when you're the British East India Company, you are nominally sort of independent, but you're ultimately backed up by the British state, just as the United Fruit Company was backed up by the CIA. Okay? So, what we have is called the First Opium War, when Britain declared war on China in order to, as you owe us compensation for destroyed British product. And by this point, it was apparent that, maybe the barbarians are superior to China in terms of military technology. Okay, so, the steamships that got to China and the gun technology, that made short work of the Chinese warships. Okay, and so that was the first of sort of the this really woke up China. Okay, they realized, holy smoke, while we were sleeping, the rest of the world got more advanced, and but the British certainly won that, and that's how they got their hands on Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was going to be British in perpetuity, and they also got free access to ports, to trade, not just at Canton, and they got reparations from China for the opium. Now, a few years later, China attempted to renegotiate this deal. Things went so sour that led to the Second Opium War, which was ended with the Treaty of Tianjin, which again was one of these unequal treaties. All documents were to be in English, and British warships were to have unlimited access to Chinese rivers. So this is, the British really are lording it over China. Now, they never break China up like they did Africa. So they have an interest in keeping a unified Chinese state. But what they do, and again, other people eventually get in on this act, is that they establish spheres of influence. Okay, and so here's a map showing some of these. You can see where the Hong Kong British from 1898. All right, that's not exactly accurate. Okay, Hong Kong was British from an earlier time. In 1898, that's when they grabbed Kowloon. Okay, and that was a 99-year lease, which is why Hong Kong went back to China in 1997. Okay, but you can see there, that's British. The French they have a sphere of influence. The Germans have a sphere of influence. The Russians get some, and then of course Japan also gets in on the action too. Hold that thought about Japan. But you see what's going on here. Various European powers come to China and they force treaties on China, saying our nationals have the right to come to China. It's your country. But our nationals have extraterritoriality. That is, that in our sphere of influence, they are not governed by Chinese law, they're governed by our law. And so if you get an English person going to China committing a crime, he will not be judged by Chinese law, he'll be judged by British law, and presumably the British will go easier on him. Okay, so this is deeply humiliating for the Chinese. But it does contrast with Africa. They don't actually tear the place up. They just establish spheres of influence. Here's a political cartoon illustrating this. You've got, that's Queen Victoria of Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, and then the Russian Tsar. You've got, that's Marianne in the back, the symbol of France. And then there's a Japanese samurai there, all examining the Chinese pie. It's a French cartoon, so it says Xin, all right? And then in the back, you've got a Manchu civil servant with his long fingernails and his pigtail getting upset about the great powers dividing up his country. And I mean, rightly so, huh? Unfortunately, China was not blessed with particularly good leadership. Okay, by the late 19th century, the real power behind the throne was known as Empress Dowager Cixi. Her son ruled, I mean, her son reigned, but she was the real power behind it. And, you know, after losing a war to the Japanese, there was this idea that maybe we should modernize our navy. And so there was a reforming party that managed to get a promise that they got some money set aside to modernize the navy. But the Empress Dowager Cixi succeeded in basically getting her hands on that and building a summer palace with it. And one of the things she did as a kind of a joke was establish these marble boats, which are basically just pavilions. You could come, and I mean, it's not a functional boat, it just looks like one. And that was her idea. This is going to be our navy, it's going to be entirely for my pleasure. So she's the sort of person who would rather be in charge of a mediocre place than risk improving it and thereby risk her own position. Okay, so in 1899 to 1901, the Chinese had what was known as the Boxer Rebellion. They themselves, well, it was a secret society in China called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Okay, at first this was a rebellion against Cixi, but then she said, oh no, really, I'm on your side. The Westerners are our real enemies. And so she successfully turned them against the Westerners. So that meant that the Westerners had to come and put the fear of God into the Chinese, okay? And so that's what it's called, the Eight Power Alliance. Britain, France, Austria, Germany, Japan, the USA, yes, indeed, we were involved in this, Italy, and Russia all came in order to put down the Boxer Rebellion. There are some boxers on the left, and there is a Japanese woodcut of the Eight Power Alliance with the various flags, and you can see the American flag in there. So China is not in a very good way. It's being overrun by foreigners, and it's being run by someone who's really interested in clinging to power, but not interested in reform. The emperorship comes to an end in 1911. It's at that point that there was a widespread revolution. It was one of these, it was just started with a railway strike, and then it just went from there. It just spread all over the place. And what happened was that the emperor basically agreed to abdicate. He wasn't killed. He got to stay in the Forbidden City in Beijing. There's a wonderful movie about this called The Last Emperor. Okay, but he got to stay in the palace. But power was really run by Sun Yat-sen, who was a major Chinese reformer. He was actually in America when the revolution broke out, so he hurried back to assume leadership of the Kuomintang, meaning the Nationalist Party. So the Nationalist Party took over. So from 1911, China was no longer an empire, it was a republic. And the capital of the Republic of China was Nanjing in the south. Unfortunately, as ever is the case with revolution, Sun Yat-sen and the Kuomintang were not really in control of most of the country. It was divided up. It's called the era of the warlords. You know, strong men held power on a local scale. But it was a period of openness. You know, they did try certain reforms. They did open up to the West, but they still suffered a certain extraterritoriality with European powers. Okay, so that's a sad thing. What about Japan? Japan across the water. Japan is an interesting contrast to China. Japan was even more isolationist than China was. Starting in 1600, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. That is, they had an emperor, but he was simply a figurehead. The real power was held by the shogun, all right, who is essentially the chief samurai. And samurai were, they were, well, people talk about Japan as being very medieval. Okay, so you had local lords who are, they're landowners, but they also train full time, like the nobility of medieval Europe. So this was a feudal class system, and the whole country was closed to outsiders. I think they allowed the Dutch to trade at Nagasaki, but on the whole, they were deeply afraid of anything outside. They saw it as a threat. It's kind of like Sparta. Any possibility of foreign influence is going to upset this little balance that they've got. Well, in 1854, that changed, and it changed again because of America. Commodore Matthew Perry was sent to Japan, and there were warships that appeared in Tokyo Bay, and they said, we're not leaving until we sign a treaty. And so the Japanese did give in. They saw the power that Americans had. And so Japan was open to trade, and I'm afraid that the samurai were right. All of these products of the Industrial Revolution came flowing in. And ordinary Japanese people were like, whoa, our leaders have kept this from us. Maybe Japan isn't as good as they say they are. Maybe we have something to learn from the rest of the world. And these people who've ruled us they don't have our interests at heart. So yeah, there is widespread social upheaval in 1850s and 1860s. Finally, in 1867, you have something called the Meiji Restoration, which is a very significant event in modern Japanese history. What happened is that they deposed the shogun, and they basically disenfranchised the samurai. If you're interested in a movie about that, you should see The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. So what this meant is that the emperor, real power was returned to the emperor, which in practice meant that the reforming party was now calling the shots. Okay? And it's a very interesting situation. So basically from 1867 on, Meiji Japan was exceptionally enthusiastic about modernizing. Okay? There were some people who regretted this. They liked it when Japan was free of foreign influence. But the answer there is, look, if we don't modernize, we are going to end up like China. We are going to end up the plaything of the West. So we have to modernize. And it is one of the most remarkable transformations. Within 30 years, Japan had basically transformed itself into a first world country. There's the program of the Meiji Japanese there. To establish deliberative assemblies, involve all classes in state affairs, not just the samurai. Freedom of social and occupational mobility, so you can choose your career and you can choose to move around if you wish. Both of those things had been forbidden in the Tokugawa shogunate. And yes, they had an international search for knowledge to strengthen imperial rule. So they brought experts in, they paid them very handsomely to teach them engineering, military experts to teach them about modern arms. They would send their sons to Sandhurst or West Point to learn about military organization at these places. And so by 1900, Japan is basically, it's like a European country. And of course, unfortunately, they got into some very bad habits because, of course, if you are going to be a European country, if you are going to be taken seriously, what do you need? At this point, you need colonies. You need colonies. So Japan, in trying to avoid being colonized, becomes a colonizer. So they do fight wars with Japan. There's a Sino-Japanese war. Excuse me, Japan fights wars with China. Sino is the adjective for China. I don't know why the CH transforms into an S. But every time you see Sino something, that refers to China. So the Sino-Japanese War is a war between China and Japan in 1895, which the Japanese won, and they got influence over Korea, and they also took over the island of Formosa, which is where Taiwan now is. And then they fought a war against the Russians in 1905. That's the Russo-Japanese War. And that was a stunning victory for the Japanese. They basically pulled up Pearl Harbor on Port Arthur and won. And then the Russians steamed around. And when they got there, the Japanese made short work of them. So after the Russo-Japanese War, Japan got influence over Manchuria, which is a part of northern China. They completely annexed Korea in 1910. Okay. In World War I, they actually sided with the Allies. They sided with France, Russia, and Britain. Okay. So whatever fighting needed to be done, they did it. But after the war, they were kind of shortchanged. Actually, I don't think anyone was happy with the settlement of the war. But Japan felt it was entitled to some kind of a reward. And so Germany had colonies in the Pacific, and Japan thought that they should get those colonies. Now, they did get the rights to the German concession in China, but New Guinea and Samoa went elsewhere. New Guinea went to Australia, and Samoa went to America. Okay, and so the Japanese they had this sneaking suspicion that no matter how good they were, no matter how Western they became, they would never be accepted as an equal by any Western power, okay, because they weren't white. All right, they could act as white as they wanted, but the West would never treat them as equals. And so that poisonous legacy in part feeds into World War II, when Japan was definitely not on the side of the Allies in World War II. So that's another couple of, it's about European imperialism on the far side of the world, okay? China does not get carved up like Africa does. It just has extraterritoriality and unequal treaties forced on it. Japan thinks it can beat the Westerners at their own game, but they can't quite do that. All right, so that is the end of this lecture.